said, we have shocking evidence that the collusion that they claim happened in Russia, which didn't happen, happened in Ukraine, and it happened with Hillary Clinton. George Soros was behind it. George Soros' company was funding it.
But you accept now that that's not true.
I accept that it is true. I can prove it. There are affidavits to prove that they were colluding with the Ukrainians, conspiring with the Ukrainians. There's a specific person in the DNC who was designated to get this information. There are 5 Ukrainian witnesses under oath saying it that are online. And if you had any regard for equal justice under the law, you would be looking for those. Well, let me ask the following question to anybody at home. If I change the names of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden to Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr., 8 million from Ukraine while under investigation, 1.5 billion from China while negotiating with China. Would I be sitting here? George, please let me finish.
But you just made.
I know it's a damaging sentence.
The 1.5 billion is simply not true.
It is simply true.
It is not true.
How do you know it's not true? Have you seen the documents?
We've seen what the fund that you're talking about was set up. Hunter Biden was on the advisory board. He wasn't an investor until 2017, and there's no evidence that they've gotten 1.5 billion.
There's evidence that they got $1 billion directly from China. Specific date, 12 days after they returned from a trip to China. There's evidence that another 500 million went in, and there are 3 partners: Rosemont Seneca, that's Hunter Biden, and the stepson of the Secretary of State. The second partner is the Bank of China, and the third partner is a company called Thornton Group. And the principal of Thornton Group is white.
Have you ever talked to Chinese nationals about investigating Hunter Biden or Joe Biden?
Let me finish the sentence before you try to figure out what I might have done wrong in revealing this evidence that you're telling me isn't true, which I've seen. So the principles.
Well, others have counter evidence, and I'm responding with that.
Well, then let's investigate it. Maybe I'm wrong.
Have you asked the Chinese to investigate that?
Can I finish what it is that I haven't finished?
Okay, then answer
what
the
I would
question.
have asked them to investigate if I did. The 1.5 billion was in a company that was specially established called Bohai Harvest Rosemont Seneca, or some crazy name like that. The partners were Joe Biden's son, John Kerry's stepson, the Bank of China, 1/3 partner at least, and the Thornton Group that was owned by Whitey Bulger's nephew. Now, that's all out there. You can go look at it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It should be investigated.
What Hunter Biden's lawyer said.
Did I ever ask the Chinese government? No. It's not my. If I did that, you could truly say I was investigating Joe Biden. I'm not investigating Joe Biden. I fell upon Joe Biden in investigating how the Ukrainians were conspiring with the Hillary Clinton campaign to turn over dirty information, including something for which a Ukrainian has already been convicted. So I have a very solid basis for doing it. I also support everything I say with affidavits. I have an affidavit here that's been online for 6 months that nobody bothered to read, from the gentleman who was fired, Victor Shokin, the so-called corrupt prosecutor. The Biden people say that he wasn't investigating Hunter Biden at the time. He says under oath that he was.
But as you know, I know he says that under oath.
He must not be. We don't even know him. He must not be telling the truth.
We know that Vice President Biden was part of an international effort, was part of a government-wide effort to help push the prosecutor out because
the name here was Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr., and it said that the president of the Ukraine asked me to resign due to pressure from the U.S. presidential administration. The truth is that I was forced out because I was leading a wide-ranging corruption probe into Burisma Holdings and Joe Biden's son. That's under oath by the prosecutor who was handling the case, who they say is corrupt. Now, a lot of prosecutors.
It's not just they have said it's corrupt. The European Union said it's corrupt. The entire U.S. administration.
Oh, they all said it. Anybody prove it?
That's why he was removed from office.
No, it wasn't. The reason he was removed from office was he resigned because the president forced him to resign. And then, just in case we want to deal with the corruption thing, I have another affidavit, this time from another Ukrainian prosecutor who says that the day after Biden strong-armed the president to remove Shokin, they show up in the prosecutor's office, lawyers for Hunter Biden show up in the prosecutor's office, and they give an apology for dissemination of false information.
I know.
And you know what the apology is for? For having gotten out the story that this guy was corrupt. Now, if you met this guy, he's not very good at corruption because he's very poor.
Well,
unlike the prosecutor who tanked the case on Biden, who's driving around in a Bentley.
Okay, you've gotten those charges out there. Let's talk.
No,
about
I haven't gotten them out there.
No, you have gotten them out.
No, I
there.
haven't.
You just
these
raised
are
those affidavits.
Can I make a contrast? Can I just make a slight contrast with the so-called whistleblower? The whistleblower says, I don't have any direct knowledge. I just heard things. Up until 2 weeks before he did that, that wouldn't even have been a complaint. It would have been dismissed.
Those are from he heard things from White House officials, and everything in that that he said about the phone call is basically tracks the transcript that was revealed.
You know what he's wrong about? He says about the phone call that my meeting with Mr. Yermak was a direct result of the phone call. No, it wasn't. The meeting was set up 3 days before the phone call. It wasn't a direct result of the phone call. He said that he heard from numerous military people that I attempted to contact two individuals, Andrei Boldan and a fellow named Kononov. The simple fact is I never did. It's a total lie. I never would have contacted Andrei Boldan because I had been told by very, very good authorities that he's corrupt.
You said earlier...
And I shouldn't go near him. He said about 5 other things that are totally false.
And this is what the investigation...
And I'm not saying he was false. I'm saying he could have heard it wrong. That's why, George, that's why it's hearsay. Because it's unreliable, inherently unreliable.
That's what the investigation is about.
Unlike him, please, can I just make my point?
You've been making your point.
No, I haven't. Unlike him, these are affidavits.
From individuals who are implicated and who've been
Isn't that the way we prosecute crime? With people implicated?
That will be part of the investigation that the House is conducting.
How about if I tell you over the next week 4 more of these will come out from 4 other prosecutors?
And they will all be investigated. Meantime,
no, George, they won't be. Because they've been online for 6 months. And the Washington press will not accept the fact that Joe Biden may have done something like this.
If these are so serious...
If this were Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr., I wouldn't be here having to do this.
Mr. Mayor,
I am defending my client the best way I know how. This is not about getting Joe Biden in trouble. This is about proving that Donald Trump was framed by the Democrats.
If these charges are so serious and so credible, why have they not been picked up by the president's hand-picked FBI director, the president's hand-picked Attorney General William Barr?
I don't know. Maybe they have been. I don't know if they have been or they haven't. And if I did, I couldn't tell you.
But isn't that the appropriate place for that if they are serious and credible charges rather than...
One of the ways this came to me is that the 4 different Ukrainian prosecutors, you can dismiss them all. I can't if they're willing to swear under oath. Tell me that they tried to get it to the FBI and the Justice Department for an entire year and were completely...
The president picked the head of the FBI. The president picked the head of the Justice Department. If they're serious...
Well, William Barr wasn't at the Justice Department.
He's there now.
Well, I'm not telling you whether they are or aren't investigating it. I'm telling you, look, I got this a long time ago. In November of 2018, very serious concerns at that time by the Ukrainian prosecutors